Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Salant. I am the HOA Information Officer for the Division of Real Estate, which is a division of the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. This morning, we are joined by our guest speaker, Wes Wollenweber. I'm going to introduce him more fully in just a moment. We are going to talk about internal dispute resolution, specifically conflict resolution for board members and community association managers. There are two handouts attached to this webinar, a PDF copy of this presentation and a copy of the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. You may download both of these handouts at any time by clicking on the blue links located under the Handouts tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. And in case you are unfamiliar, this is what the GoToWebinar control panel looks like. The highlighted section shows where you can access the links to today's handouts. And if you are having any trouble accessing the handouts, please contact me after the webinar and I'm happy to provide you with copies. Please note that the information provided during this presentation is for educational purposes only and is not meant to provide or to be construed as legal advice. Any legal questions should be directed to your attorney. And before we hop into the presentation topics, I want to take a moment to talk with you about my office, the HOA Information and Resource Center. The HOA Center is a statutorily created office, and my position, the HOA Information Officer, is appointed by the Director of the Division of Real Estate. Per statute, the HOA Center provides information to homeowners regarding their basic rights and responsibilities under Kiowa. It gathers, analyzes, and reports information through complaints and HOA registrations. The office writes an annual report to the legislature. It creates resource materials, provides education, and presents HOA forums such as this one. We also maintain a website with information for the public, and we also register HOAs. As for what my office does not do, my office is not a regulatory program. We do not mediate or arbitrate. We cannot provide legal advice. We do not act as an advocate. We do not assess fines or penalties, and we cannot enforce an HOA's failure to register. And on to today's special guest. Today we welcome Wes Wollenweber. Wes is a lawyer and a mediator in Lakewood with over 22 years of experience litigating disputes related to housing and community associations. Wes has handled complex trials pertaining to homeowner associations related to enforcement of covenants, construction defects, water intrusion and mold damage disputes, easement disputes, and fair housing. He has represented both homeowners and associations in these types of disputes. After years of trying cases, Wes now devotes his energy to mediating these same disputes. As a student of conflict, Wes's passion is resolving conflict. He is the managing partner at his firm, Pearson Wollenweber Friedman, where the focus is all things housing. He is also the author of the book, HOAs on the Edge: How to Deal with Expectations, Risks, and Alternatives in Community Legal Disputes, which focuses on the risks of litigating HOA disputes. And with that, Wes, I will welcome you. Thank you so much for being with us today. I will be managing your slides, so when you're ready, just let me know next. Otherwise, the show is yours.
All right, fantastic. Thanks for the great introduction. I'm thrilled to be with everybody today. I teach a lot of different types of topics that pertain to housing, with fair housing being a big emphasis, but this by far, after several years of teaching, is my favorite program. But it's a little bit selfish as to why. I'm a native of Colorado, and before I ever signed my first law school application, I knew with all my heart that on top of being a trial attorney, one day I'd want to be a mediator. And that day's finally here. For about the last 5 years, I've transitioned from being a trial attorney to being a mediator, which means I'm a third party that comes in between two or more parties that are in a major dispute, and I try to help them facilitate a settlement. But I've been in housing for years, and I've worked with community managers, a lot of different boards. And as Jeffrey said, I've represented homeowners against associations. I've represented neighbors against neighbors. I've kind of seen a lot of the landscape of what I call high conflict community disputes. So I got the vision a couple years ago to put this program together. In my world as a lawyer, we call what we do as mediators alternative dispute resolution. So the name of this program that you're with me on this morning is called Internal Dispute Resolution. And I try to create this program for board members, people who are there like you, many of you that are listening today, who are the governing body for your community. And the last I heard, that job doesn't pay a whole lot of dough. It's a volunteer gig. But yet you're the ones responsible, despite not making any money, to enforce the community rules through your covenants, your declaration, enforce them even-handedly. And sometimes, as we all know, what comes with that is a lot of conflict. And it's a certain type of conflict. And I wrote a book around this topic. And one of the reasons I did that is I mediate other things too. Employment disputes, conflicts where there often is this element where people's lives are messed up because of the conflict. But what makes the disputes we're going to talk about this morning different is many times people in an HOA, neighborhood, community dispute have to live together after the dust settles, whether that issue got resolved or not. Makes it a different type of conflict. So as a mediator, I had to get some training, and it wasn't something that just purely naturally came to me. And that's a little bit of my introduction here. So if we could go to the introduction slide, you see there the roadmap we're going to go through today. A little bit more about me and why I did this program. I have sat in programs like this where a mediator is talking to HOA board members, maybe some HOA community managers, maybe even members of the community about community disputes. And nothing against those speakers, but what my takeaway from those programs is I didn't get any hard, fast tools. How do you resolve a community dispute where there's more than a few people at each other's throats about something, or a gigantic misunderstanding that's leading to conflict? So when I came up with this program, I wanted to give people tools. And it's really designed for those that are at the helm, such as a board member, president, a vice president, treasurer, who are going to executive session and dealing with conflicts, and then maybe at a live board meeting, a monthly board meeting, an annual, a budget review meeting, and dealing with some of the inherent conflict. I wanted to give some of the tools that I've learned that work for me as a mediator to you. When I teach this class live, it's designed for others to teach me what works for them. In our format today, I'm going to share some of those things that I've learned from folks who have learned better than me how to deal with the type of group dynamic conflicts that go on in an HOA setting. So let's go to our first slide here. Community conflict. Is there a role to play, whether you're a member of the community, on the board, or a manager? What really happens in a community setting is if you're on the board of directors or you're an HOA manager, you're an intermediary, whether you like it or not. So what is an intermediary? We'll go to the next slide. Here's a little quote that I always like to start with. I'm not sure who invented it, but I use it all the time. The pursuit of peace without the promise of peace is not a pointless pursuit. Why do I throw this quote in? Because when you're in a community conflict, your goal really has to be, let's try to see if we could get this thing to a place where people aren't blowing up and there's some peace on it. Whether you get there or not, trying to get there is really a huge step in resolving conflict. You have to make a commitment to get there. All right, next slide. What does conflict look like for those that are community managers? Next. Well, I've been around a lot of community managers over the years as an HOA-based attorney, and they have rough jobs. I mean, I think the one thing I have in common with community managers is a lot of conflict. And what impact does it have? Confusion, burnout, confusion in how do I get this issue resolved? And man, I am fried. I'm worn out from it. Same for many board members that I talk to. We'll go to the next. And that's why I named this class Internal Dispute Resolution. Community manager, if there's any in the audience, I don't know if we do, we'll go to board members here in just a minute, serve a vital role. in directing the board members, helping the board members, responding to the board members deal with conflict. So like I mentioned, in my world, it's ADR. In your world, I'm calling it IDR, internal dispute resolution. You're in the heat of a conflict that's going on. In my community where I live, there's a massive conflict right now. And it might not be that different than some of the ones you all might be dealing with. I'm in kind of just a typical run-of-the-mill suburban association on the west side of town, and they've decided they want a swimming pool. There are many older residents who don't have kids and they don't want the swimming pool. And like my neighbors who have young kids desperately want the swimming pool, and it's leading to friction that's kind of bleeding out from board meetings to neighbor communications. It's internal, it's inside the community, and everybody knows it. Next. But one thing I want to say before we start going into some tools, this is the irony of conflict. The more people embrace conflict, the more they're equipped to actually resolve it. You have to embrace it to resolve it. And that is where the tools are going to come from in today's presentation. I'm really going to talk about embracing conflict in a community setting. And the reason that's so important to me is I've watched a lot of board members and even HOA community managers avoid conflict, just kind of shove it to the side, try to deal with it later. Inevitably, as a student of conflict, which I most definitely am, I'm always thinking about conflict. We live in such an us versus them society that I'm always watching how people deal with conflict. The biggest thing I've personally learned is that when you avoid it, one thing that's for sure, it isn't gonna go away and you're gonna be dealing with it later, and it may have festered by the time you start really dealing with it. So that's the irony. You've got to get after a community conflict. Let's go 2 slides ahead if we could to board members. Excellent. Now, board members who can help in that process with the manager that's dealing with an issue like maybe my community. How are we going to approach the topic of half the communities in Camp 1, they want a swimming pool, half the communities in Camp 2, they don't want a swimming pool. Board members bring a powerful balance to the conflict in general, because they're the ones who are going to meet and try to figure out solutions. And volunteer or not, that's kind of what you're charged to do anyway when you take on the role. You got a fiduciary duty, as a matter of fact, under the law Jeffrey mentioned, the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, Kiowa. You've got a duty to try to resolve these kind of problems as they come to your doorstep as the board of directors. Let's go to the next slide. Why is confronting conflict important in a community? The thing I was mentioning is, as I've said in other programs, sometimes I didn't get tools, and a lot of the emphasis in those programs, not to slight the presenters, they're probably very talented mediators, but the emphasis in those programs was we all just got to get along. We all have to come together. And that is not my emphasis for you today at all. You need tools. Conflict is tough, and a lot of times it still doesn't bring people together, even having the right tools. But I will tell you this. Here's what I've seen, without a doubt. And it's not my let's sing kumbaya together message. This is what I really believe as somebody who's been in the trenches of conflict for 22 years with HOA related disputes. Confronting conflict leads to a stronger community. One of the things I still really love about HOA work is when you look at a community like many of yours, if you really think about it from this standpoint, your community is a group of members much like the colonies that our country started with, where it's governed by the people for the people. People get a vote under Kiowa to amend a declaration, to adopt new rules. And I like the democracy of that. And when people can have civil discourse about what they disagree about, I still firmly believe in today's world, it can lead to building better relationships. Next slide. But it's very inherently needed in a community to have discussions about conflicts so they don't fester. Next. The voice of a community manager is a loud voice. You are somebody who has a contract with your community client and you speak on behalf of the community, so your voice is a super important voice for those of you who may manage community. But let's talk too about the voice of the board member. Next slide. Like the community manager, your voice is incredibly important. You're at the helm, you're the governing body. And honestly, in that role, what you say has to be heard and must be heard, but sometimes how to say it is really important, and that's where the tools today come in on resolving internal conflict. Let's talk about what the goals for today's 1 hour program are, what I hope your takeaways are. If we could go to the next slide. Number one, I want everybody to embrace conflict as a means to achieve bigger objectives. In my community, they want to figure out if they're going to build that pool. It's a big objective. A lot of people have brought it to the forefront. The board is doing a fantastic job, from what I can tell, embracing it and strategizing it as an example. So we want to talk about how to embrace it. And the tools I'm going to give you today heavily focus on that. Second goal, learn those fundamental tools that I've been kind of previewing that will help resolve group conflicts. And third, that leads into the third goal. How do you empower others to use these tools with you? Group conflicts just lend themselves to, when you're in the thick of it, bringing somebody else in who you can tell is going to be an ally. Maybe you've got a problem with a structural defect and you need an engineer that the association, the HOA, has engaged to come in and talk about the defect. That's the third thing we're going to talk about. How do you draw other individuals into the conflict to help you? So those are our goals. Next, the problem of community conflict. Well, I like to teach through scenarios, and a lot of times my scenarios fit what's going on out there in many communities. I picked one that's a multifamily scenario here that we're all going to discuss together. And I'm going to ask you some questions. And if you've got a pen and paper or some way to take a note, you might jot down what your thoughts are. And then hopefully some of the answers to these scenarios that I've learned from really strong board members might match up with some of the things you're thinking in your head. So let's go to our first scenario, which is the next bubble or slide. All right, here's the scenario. Let's say your community is dealing with this. You're leading an annual meeting. Your board's there. It's the annual yearly meeting, and the key topic on the agenda is whether members should be getting what is called HO6 insurance. I don't know if that's a topic that's come up in any other trainings through Jeffrey's organization, through Dora, that talk about what homeowner insurance should be, but it's a type of policy that helps cover large deductibles. The association's deductible in our scenario for a wind and hail claim that's caused massive damage to the community's roofs, exterior sidings, and decks is the topic. Crucial to this discussion is the association's current financial health and how to come up with the full amount of the deductible. Harry homeowner tries to hijack the meeting. Now, I don't know about you, but gee, that never happens, does it? Where one member tries to derail a meeting. Forgive my sarcasm, but I've seen it quite a bit, and it's always tough. In doing so, Harry claims that the current dues are providing no benefit to the community, which is not the topic. It's not about dues, it's about insurance. But that inspires 4 other owners to join in and back him in this argument that derails the entire conversation. Let's go to the next slide. This scenario is designed to talk about what are the roadblocks for board of directors when they're in a meeting and there's a group conflict. In this situation, it's the same for managers and board members. Harry homeowners hijacking the discussion all of a sudden. Is that a conflict? Boy, in my world, it's a big conflict because it creates immediate tension and you're off topic, and that creates conflict definitely and can lead even to high conflict. And I came up with this because my law firm does represent multifamily communities on insurance issues like wind and hail loss, and I've seen communities really get upset over how they're going to pay for the roofs and how they're going to cover a deductible. Let's go to the next slide. So if the conflict perpetuates in that meeting, what happens? but you jot down a few things that you've seen happen when somebody derails the agenda at a board meeting, and can you break through that? Before we talk about those roadblocks, let's talk about board members as leaders and negotiators. Next. Leaders are negotiators. I just think in life, that is a fundamental truth, a universal truth. Leaders end up negotiating no matter what they do and who they are. And you as board members or members of the community that might be on the architectural committee, design review committee, or a special committee, you're all leaders, and negotiation will become part of your world. And that's where I'm heading with today's program. Where does negotiation fit in? Next slide. Well, it fits in everywhere. How are you going to resolve Harry? Well, in prior programs that are live and in person, had one board member say, I'll tell you how it works. Robert's Rules of Orders. Harry, not your turn to talk. Sit down, shut up, and listen to what the board is trying to talk about here, which are deductibles, not how we're maintaining the community and how your dues are being spent. That's not the topic. So that's been a suggestion. Another suggestion was just keep moving on and evade him. Well, what are the roadblocks that we mentioned there? Mostly what I see happen when you either evade or rely strictly on Robert's Rules of Orders, those other members in our scenario that are siding with Harry keep hijacking the meeting. They want their voice heard, and you may not get back to the deductible issue. Hopefully some of you are sitting where you're at right now, shaking your head. Yeah, Wes, I kind of can relate to that. I'm hoping that you relate to that and that rings true, maybe some catharsis for some of you. Certainly is for me. I've been in those board meetings where we're just trying to talk about how to get the roofs fixed, and people want to talk about other things. They weren't there at prior meetings when there was maybe a construction loan to fix the community, but now they're there because their roofs are leaking and they're mad about other things. So where does negotiation fit in? We're going to do two different things today in the time that we've got together to work through this typical scenario and maybe a few others that you're all wrestling with. I'll try to come up with some pretty common ones. We're going to do A and B. A, we're going to talk about something called the principled negotiation method. That was pretty much invented by authors at Harvard. They're very public. They have books about it called Getting to Yes. There are some people that feel that isn't necessarily the way to go in negotiation, but I'm here today to tell you it's worked for me. When I was a young trial lawyer and I had to first cross-examine a witness, I was like, oh my gosh, I am no Perry Mason. And now that I'm fulfilling a lifelong dream of being a mediator, it's no different. I realized I've needed some tools. These tools have really helped. And then B, we're going to talk about international diplomacy tips from great international diplomats who've negotiated gigantic community conflicts like the troubles in Northern Ireland. Let me get my head on straight here. Northern Ireland, where there's been massive community conflicts for years. So I've tried to learn from both these areas of teaching, and it's been very helpful with HOA community conflicts. Next slide. Here's a little roadmap of the principled negotiation method. 4 major things we're going to kind of talk through and apply to this scenario that I just gave you with Harry homeowner derailing everybody, and a few other scenarios. Number 1, the big thing I've learned from the principled negotiation method, Getting to Yes, is you've got to separate people from whatever the problem is. And we're going to talk about in a group dynamic, how do you do that? How do you even start to do it? 2, we're going to talk about focusing on people's real interest. 3, inventing options, ways to solve the problem. I really see that going on in my own community with the pool. They're trying to figure out ways to approach it and have a dialogue with the entire community on it. No easy task. And then us all funnels down to committing to resolution and how you do it. And when we get to the international diplomacy tips, they really fill in a lot of blanks in these 4 boxes. They kind of integrate very nicely. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll start with separating people from the problem. Next. All right, how do you do this? When you got Harry hijacking everybody, you got temper starting to rise really quickly. That's one of the hard things about conflict. And Jeffrey reminded me that one of the key things that happens a lot, that's probably been discussed in some of the other programs that you've been a part of, is personality conflicts can really get enraged in an HOA community conflict. They start to spike, and I would think a lot of us probably feel the same way. It can be like gasoline on a fire, depending on those personality conflicts. So here's a tip. Start out with the attitude that you got to be hard on the issue, not the person. When boards and managers push back really hard, the room elevates even more. So I just have to level with you. I have a temper. I can be quick to temper. I've been a trial lawyer and have had conflict with a lot of rough lawyers over the years. And the one thing I've learned is this issue: be hard, bring it down a little bit, be hard on the issue, but not the person. You know, you start yelling at Harry, telling him the Roberts rules, order need to apply, and he may just spike, and so may his 4 allies in that group dynamic. You want to start out and reframe the issue. We're talking about HO6 insurance and how to pay for this deductible and what we're going to do to pay for this massive deductible. But if you don't hear people out on some level, you could have problems. And I realized in a board meeting, like the example we're talking about, if you hear people out too much, things just get out of control. And sometimes you can't hear the person out at all because they're going to hijack everything. But your average person, in my opinion, needs to be heard on some level. So you got to balance that a little bit. What I've noticed, it's not a rule of thumb, but it's a pretty good guidepost. Hearing someone out will often de-escalate the anger that's being caused if you can do it the right way. We're going to talk about a few more tips on that. Next slide. Well, with our scenario, how do you do it? So write down, think about some of your conflicts that you've had in your communities, what the topic has been. We have this one where Harry wants to talk about the fact that the HOA and the board are not using his monies and other members' monies properly, when the topic is not that. Ain't that at all. It's how are we going to pay for the roofs and how are we going to cover the deductible for the association's insurance policy, which is a very large deductible. Are we A, going to have to do a special assessment, B, raise dues, or C, find some other, option? Right there, the board's trying to strategize and not talk about these other issues. Let's think of another scenario that maybe some of you have gone through, where maybe you need to amend your community's declaration. It's old. The developer wrote it years ago, not knowing that in 2015, 2020, 2021, you'd be dealing with all kinds of new issues that weren't pertinent issues. A lot of HOAs have aging issues, like we heard about in Florida, that led to a terrible travesty. You might be dealing with how to amend it, how to get the votes, and you're just trying to educate your membership, and people start blowing up over it, and it gets derailed. What are some things that you think of as a board member or on a committee, architectural review committee, would you do to try to get the topic back on topic and resolve the initial conflict? So I put this out to a lot of different folks, and this doesn't come from principled negotiation. This comes from either owners of good community management companies or some board members I know who are outstanding leaders as the governing body for their HOAs. Negotiate by educating on that topic. You can clear up some misunderstandings and maybe reframe the problem. Like, hey, Harry, we don't want to shoot you down. We do need to talk about some of the things that are going on in the community that you brought up, but we have got to talk about this insurance issue. If we don't solve it, we may have a massive special assessment. Do you want that? That reframes that issue, and you do it by educating. I've watched this really work, getting people back on the right topic and overcoming their objection to try to get them focused. Which leads us to the second concept, next slide, on focusing on people's interests. Mediating lawsuits and even pre-litigation matters, one of the things that I really notice that the principled negotiation method helps with is people start out with positions. Their position is that they're going to win this lawsuit, or you're wrong, you don't maintain our common areas, you stink, board, you don't do what you're supposed to. That's a position. But over here, deep in their soul, as a member of your community, they may have a different interest. What really is their interest? And in community disputes, one of the things that works very well for me when I resolve conflicts, I had a conflict last week where an aging condo community has very loud subfloors. The subfloor, which is gypcrete, is cracking. And so several owners are experiencing noise from their upstairs neighbors. And the HOA is kind of, no pun intended, sandwiched in between because they control that common area. And there's a lot of heated emotions around it because it's loud, and there's not a great permanent solution because it's an aging building. So, you know, people have their position. Well, I'm the victim. I'm the one downstairs. Upstairs neighbor, I'm the victim. I have to move out so she can have quiet floors, and I have to go somewhere. And it created quite an emotional mediation. One of the things that helped me in that was figuring out what people's values were regarding their community. And I typically can find common ground that way. What is the true value in the conflict? In that value is somebody's true interest. Maybe Harry is just as concerned as his other neighbors that he doesn't want a $9,000 special assessment to cover the deductible. So maybe the better topic in educating him and weeding out his values is how are we going to come up with a solution on this? It's not a guarantee that you'll get the meeting back on track with Harry, but I've watched it work, getting at somebody's real interest. And you have to do that through some dialogue and figuring out maybe what they want is what the neighbor wants. All right, next slide. Once you get there and you get people back on topic and reframe the issue, then you got to immediately start inventing options to get at the root of the problem. Maybe a whiteboard is a great thing to have at that meeting. If it's on Zoom, maybe you share a pre-planned document. One thing that I've learned presenting this program from really good board members and some really good community managers is anticipate where some people may bring conflict to the group meeting, to the board meeting. You can see it coming. I've also talked on this topic about board members who are not getting along. They don't see an issue that their community faces the same way. And then they have an internal dispute that they need to resolve. And maybe another board member could put some things down on paper ahead of time, and you talk about it and you start inventing options. If you could do it even before the dispute arises, even better. How do you go about doing that? Let's look at the next slide. You got to try to insist that the main people in the discussion participate in the solution. Do you want to just complain, or do you want to try to resolve it? And when you're hard on the issue and not the person, you could say it just like this: Harry, I get it, but do you want to solve the problem that we're all facing? Because it seems like you're the kind of guy that has a strong voice, and maybe you got some ideas. Do you want to be part of the solution? And that's how you can be hard on the issue, not the person, and start getting that individual into the discussion on creating some options. All right, let's go to the next slide. I'm just waiting for Jeffrey to catch up with me. I think there we go. Now we merge into, we're doing really good on time. Lessons from international diplomacy. Why do I have this up here? So these principled negotiation methods that we've talked about, separating people from the problem by being hard on the issue and trying to figure out, all right, let's stick to what the issue is. That works really well. It's a great starting point. And then starting to focus on what somebody's real interests are and seeing if you can get to common ground that way. Great way to go too. And then inventing some options, great way to go. But in the midst of all of that, with the group dynamic, there is still always what? What faces you as you're trying to use these negotiation tools? Think about that for a minute. So let's review. In separating people from the problem, one great way to do that is through educating everybody on the issue. And again, one of the greatest things I learned from audience participation in this program was if you could do it ahead of time somehow, kind of be a little bit clairvoyant, know what things people might bring up, and have some particular education around the topic before the meeting really helps. In the pool dispute in West Arvada, the community board brought in experts and they did a budget analysis, and they held a big annual meeting and they laid out the numbers in a slideshow presentation for all the members who attended. They knew one of the big objections was going to be in camp one, why should I spend my dues? And I'm in that camp. My son's at college. He's not going to use a pool. Why do I have to pay for that? Can't you get the names of the owners who want a pool and make them pay? And it just doesn't work that way, right, folks? People have to pay for one set of assessments and dues, but they did a great job educating everybody on the pros and cons. And I firmly believe it negated a lot of conflict that would have otherwise existed. Secondly, they invented options. Here's one way we can, do this. We're going to have to raise dues, but here's some ways that we could do it over time versus all at once. So I think that really helps. But in the midst of all this, what's the problem? The problem is group dynamics are crazy and so many things can go wrong. So on top of principled negotiation, gentleman that's facing us here in the slide, that's Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Britain. Well, I just happened to pick up his memoirs, and he had these 10 phenomenal tips from his years of also being an international diplomat. Here's a quote for him. Sometimes it's better to lose and do the right thing than to win and do the wrong thing. He's got this ethic about resolving group dynamics. And when I went through the 10 techniques, they were excellent. He's one of my heroes. So I'm like, this guy knows something I don't. Not only was he a leader of his country, but they brought him in to be the chief negotiator at the northern border of Ireland, and this age-old ongoing battle between Catholics and Protestants in that region, and he was the lead negotiator. Let's go to the next slide. He brought in with him another one of my heroes. This is Marty Ottasari from Finland, and like Blair, president of his country, and a phenomenal international diplomat, so much so that he won a Nobel Peace Prize for all the conflicts he's resolved internationally. And he helped with the Ireland discussions, as well as major things that were resolved in the Middle East. And he says the only people that can make peace are the parties to the conflict. And just as they are responsible for the conflict and its consequences, so should they be given responsibility and recognition for the peace. I think one thing that I heard through the pandemic from board members is we've always had conflict. I've been on this board 4 years. Prior to 2020, plenty of conflict, but it's really escalating, Wes. What do we do? You embrace the conflict more than ever in your community. Don't run from it. People are hurting, and yeah, the pandemic certainly has escalated a lot of things, but it's ushered in some interesting things that I've ironically seen help conflict. All right, next slide. Key aids, things we're going to learn today from these two great individuals and Tony Blair's memoirs. All right, next slide. Number one tip, Tony Blair to your desktop. You got to develop in a community conflict a framework to work from once you know that conflict's out there. The Gyp Creek issue. Floors are really noisy. Before that mediation, through a little bit of help from me, everybody framed the issue that it's got to be fixed. The framework is, no pun intended, got to fix the framing, got to fix the floor one way or the other, or this problem's never going to go away. So what are the starting points, to work from? And everybody developed a framework there. Again, there's that theme, resolved conflict through education. Maybe sometimes the education in a community conflict is framing the issue. Hey, look, here's what we're facing here. If we don't fix this subfloor, the noise is going to get worse over time, and more upstairs and downstairs units are going to face it. in the HO6 insurance issue, if we don't find a way to pay for this deductible, then the roofs are going to get worse. They may start leaking. We've got an opportunity to fix it now. That's a framework to start from. How do you do it in an HOA? Start with your governing documents. What are your governing documents? Your declaration, maybe your bylaws, maybe your governance policies like your conflict resolution, covenant enforcement policy, things that hopefully your community's general counsel has drafted in compliance with Kiowa. Start with those. What sections of those documents frame the issue? With the subfloor, it was very clear. Association has an obligation to maintain the common areas in between the flooring, and they acknowledge that they have that duty and that they need to take some control over it, but there needed to be a discussion how to get there from upstairs and downstairs owners who have noise issues. Second, develop that strategy that we talked about ahead of time if you can. Last week's mediation over the subfloor, the association's attorney did a great job telling the owners in the dispute, one of the things we should probably get the mediator to focus on is moving the upstairs owner out. Who's going to pay for what? How long is it going to take? And how do we deal with storing her belongings in a safe, proper manner? There was a lot of framework going in, and I can tell you as the mediator who got paid to resolve that dispute, if that framework hadn't have been there, there'd have been no way to settle it. We did settle it, it looks like, and the way that it got settled was having that framework. It allowed to much better discussions. If you can get your head around potential things that are going to come up as a board of directors and have some foresight, could really help. Educate on a budget. That's what my community is doing regarding the pool. And it's getting the conflict way lowered because a vote's going to happen. The majority is going to vote in what they want, and it's probably going to be the pool. So they've done a great job educating the dissent on how they're going to get there. Next slide. Remember, we started with the concept of embracing the conflict. And the irony of conflict is you got to embrace it to get anywhere with it. Such an important principle. And it is a tool. It is not my philosophy. It's not just, hey, I like conflict, I'm nuts, I've got a screw loose and I love it. Sometimes my wife tells me that, and I have to remember that I work in a world of conflict and my marriage isn't a battlefield. But hard on the issue, not the person, right? So one of the things I've really learned from Tony Blair is this irony is such a true principle. Unless you embrace the conflict and get your arms around it, you're not going to get it resolved in a group dynamic. I had the most fascinating dispute early in my mediation career. Community had a situation where Holly looks behind her fence and her neighbor has a big dome. Looks like a marijuana grow house. You got it, a grow house. Other neighbors think it's unsightly, violates the declaration, but they found out the HOA never recorded that declaration with the county clerk and recorder. What does that mean? Maybe invalid. Owner with the dome knows that, knows he might be getting a pass, that covenant's not recorded, not valid, because recorded covenants under Kiowa have to be recorded. They're not, they could be invalid and unenforceable, and actually are unenforceable. So you had a massive dispute. Turned out that the association, through help of mediators, gripped that conflict relentlessly and gathered data. Getting data and educating each other is so important. Turned out it wasn't a grow house. What do you think that dome was? It did have plants in it, but they weren't marijuana plants. They were all kinds of vegetables. This guy was a retired horticulturist. His wife was a retired nurse. They were growing vegetables and they were giving it to food banks throughout their metropolitan area. Still an unsightly thing. And the community had to really embrace that community and quit yelling at each other. There were people that knew these folks were growing vegetables and thought they were the most noble of people and the dome should just stay. And then you had another camp that thought it was a huge eyesore and really stuck out and violated the covenants. And then you got a board of directors who had a set of covenants that maybe was the answer, but wasn't because it wasn't recorded. Tough dilemma. We'll talk a little bit more about that one here in a second. How do you grip the conflict relentlessly? Don't ignore it, but start by being hard on the issue and keeping your focus. Tony Blair agrees with that principled negotiation method and point out the glaring obvious. Harry, if we don't figure this issue out, the roofs are going to leak. It's a great place to start. It really is. Next slide. Second tip from Tony Blair, attend to the minor matters. What on earth does that mean? Does that mean you abandon the Robert's Rules of Orders and let somebody go on about their dues not applying and that snow's not being done right when they're there to talk about roofs? No, it doesn't mean that. You don't let somebody become unruly. But I can tell you this, I learned a lot from this technique of attending to minor matters. Sometimes just hearing somebody out on a minor thing gives you some credibility with them. Now, it's a tough balancing act. You don't want Harry and his 4 dissenters to derail the community's entire discussion, where the majority is really concerned. How are we going to get our roofs fixed and pay for it when the association's insurance policy has a massive deductible or set of deductibles that's building by building? And this guy wants to talk about this other stuff. How dare him? Sometimes you got to hear somebody out on something just a little bit. In the subfloor dispute, I allowed the upstairs owner to talk about some things that weren't that critical to the dispute, but in hearing her out a little bit, then getting her refocused, I think 3 things happened. And I think this is true for boards that are educating their members. Number 1, you gain a little credibility. That person feels somewhat heard. 2, while you're hearing them doesn't mean you agree with their position whatsoever. And 3rd, in fact, it may help you better rebut that position. And you've got their ear. You've heard them, and now you can be harder on the issue while not being hard on them and maybe be better heard yourself. This is about the roofs, and we've got to get them fixed. So attending to minor matters, you got an international diplomat that worked with the Northern Ireland peace treaties of his time, I'd listen to that. I think it's helped me a great deal. But again, there's a balancing act. You don't want to attend to a minor matter and let things get totally out of hand. Next tip, be creative. Use those options that you were inventing to solve the problem. Start putting them up on a whiteboard or on a screen, some way where there's a visual, and getting people to start discussing those options. You start working towards solution when you start getting creative. And the people that are holding up the conversation, you might find they later become part of the problem. Now, there is a time and a place when you're trying to get creative to tell somebody, stop talking. There's nothing wrong with that. In the dome dispute, what's under that dome, one of the neighbors who really thought it was marijuana, I looked at him, and I'll bring him up again in a minute. And I knew he could be part of the problem. I knew what his real interest was. He just wants the community to look the way it always has. It's a well-kept, nice community, large trees indigenous to Colorado, ponderosas, blue spruce, evergreens, pines, beautiful community. And here's this dome sticking out. But he was interrupting the solutions. So I asked him to be quiet. Hey, now's not the time. But I heard him out on a few small things. And then it was time to really get creative. Interestingly, that gentleman had great ideas about maybe getting trees planted in the owner's yard with the dome to block the dome. That was a potentially great solution in that community where the covenants are probably not going to work. They're not recorded. The old covenants don't speak to whether you can have a structure like that. They were silent. They amended them for good reason, but the amendment never got recorded. Trees would not look out of place there. People had large trees in their yards like a lot of Coloradoans in older communities do. Turned out to be a great solution, and that gentleman was part of the problem, and the option solving was enormous. Next slide. Tony Blair says use third parties that can help. Bring a third party if necessary. A second round of discussions with the dome, they brought in an arborist who said you could plant bigger trees so that you immediately block the view. This is roughly what it's going to cost, and they took a donation. Board members, sometimes if you have a good community manager, solicit their help, or vice versa. Brainstorm. Who else can we bring in to this? Do we need to bring our broker to another meeting to talk about HO6 and what can we do with the given insurance policy. Don't discount where a third party who is an ally could help. Now, you all in your board meetings have to think about who that might be given whatever your conflict is. In my community with the pool, they brought in budget analysts for a board and informed the neighborhood about projected costs before they ever took a vote. They wanted an informed community. Why is that important to bring up? It lessened the potential conflict. Educate, educate, educate. In that community setting, it will more than likely than not lower the potential conflict. Third parties can be very crucial. Next slide. I find this one huge, and we've already hit on it. Prepare for disruption. As a board, if you know something could be a conflict, sit around and talk about, strategize, what kind of things might we encounter tomorrow night when we have this annual, or a month from now, or a week from now? What do you think might happen? And that led to my point where a very talented board member had said, we try to anticipate it, have some bullet points, ways to overcome what we knew would be objections. I saw that with my community, knowing that there's a camp like me that doesn't want a pool. It's really going to raise dues. So they knew what the objections were going to be. So they also showed a lot of the pros. I may not agree with the pros, but it was very helpful to sit at an annual, see a display of all the pros that pools in the area have raised property values in other communities, not lowered them, things like that. They anticipated some of those objections. And I think it kept the conversation much more streamlined and addressed people's real interests better. So you've got to prepare for disruption. Think about things that have disrupted your board meetings and have derailed things, and how maybe it was foreseeable if you just had a little more discussion about it. And even if your board meetings are via Zoom or some virtual platform, you can even come up with some ways of probably dealing with it. I've noticed virtual meetings actually keep things sometimes a little more streamlined, ironically. So that's a way to prepare for disruption. Next slide. Blair and Ottasari would say, capitalize on leadership as it emerges. In the dome conflict, the guy told that he had to be quiet, let people talk. He didn't like that. Why didn't he like it? Because he was a natural born leader, and I could see it. And sometimes you too will see folks, members of the audience that are there at that membership meeting. Or if you have a conflict in your board meeting, you may know that your fellow board member, Johnny Joe, is a natural born leader. Get that leader talking. Leaders can bring great ideas to the forefront. Not to be redundant, but in the dome, that gentleman who had some conflict with me because I asked him to quit talking, he ended up having some of the best ideas of anybody there. As I whiteboarded and invented options, he brought up how to do trees, knew an arborist, and by and large had some of the better input that led to a full resolution of that very difficult dispute. So he was a leader while being a dissenter. He ended up being the problem solver. Is there somebody speaking out like him that you can bring in to the dialogue? Sometimes there isn't, but if there is, don't miss that opportunity. Don't neglect to think that through. Don't rule out that an objector can become a leader in the very same situation. How do you know? Get at the value. Maybe this gentleman's value that I've been mentioning to you was exactly the same as everybody else. They want the neighborhood to look right. Once he knew it wasn't a marijuana grow house, then that calmed things down and it got back to the framework of the issue. How do we make it look better? And it wasn't just the neighbor whose fence line was right by the dome. It was his and other people's. They could see it. And it did solve the problem through a lot of creativity. All right, we're kind of going into the ninth inning here. Let's go to our next slide. Resiliency. It's kind of winding us up here with community conflict. All right, we talked about with principled negotiation methods, the fourth topic, and we're tying it to this international diplomacy of embracing the conflict, coming up with ideas, staying in the thick of it, not giving up. How do you do that? You got to commit to resolution. You got to sit down with your board members and say, we got to see this through one way or the other. But how do you commit to that resolution? People got their boxing gloves on and you're trying to get them to shake hands. Not an easy task. So now this is the part where we end with a little bit of kumbaya. These are the things I really believe that's true of most people and their spirit, who he or she is. The number one thing to keep in mind when you're trying to facilitate that resolution, if we go to the next slide, is to be resilient. How on earth can you foster resilience in yourself and other people in your community when you've got a blowout, when you've got a big emotional thing and people are going to keep living together in the midst of this conflict? All right, my first tip. These are things that have helped me not burn out. Roadblocks that we started with: burnout, confusion. Where do we go? I'm so sick of talking about this same community conflict over and over. My first tip: recharge, recharge, recharge. If you got to step away from it as a volunteer board member for a while, step away from it unless it's super time sensitive. Get your mind off of it. Come back to it if it's a lingering, ongoing thing that you have to strategize. Next slide. Don't ever be an island. One of the benefits of a community conflict, other people are in it and you got allies, your other board members, your manager, maybe your neighbors feel the same way you do. Figure out if there's a way to a team approach. That is a commitment to resolution by not getting isolated in it. That isolation brings things up, and there is an art of neighboring even when a conflict is going on, and that's keep the dialogue going. I don't mean to sound altruistic or ideological, but I really do believe that civil discourse was something that made our country strong, and I believe it can make associations very strong. Talk, and keep strategizing. Next slide. Brings me to a summary. All right, when we look at all these different things, from principled negotiation to international diplomacy and trying to get a meeting back on track where certain members hijacked it, trying to fix a structural issue that has homeowner B downstairs in conflict with homeowner A, or any other issue that your community has wrestled with, where maybe there's just that us versus them division. This is the summary of where our roadmap has taken us today with these techniques. First, you really have to think about how to frame the problem as you bring it up. Something's just come to you. You're talking about XYZ and owners bring up ABC. And maybe it's really not what was on the agenda whatsoever, but now it is the topic and you have to deal with it. Frame it. Frame the problem, even if it's live and on the spot. Boards, when you're in executive session, which, as you may know, under Kiowa has some privilege and confidentiality, don't be afraid to sit there and strategize like we've talked about and try to see the problem coming and prepare for disruptions and frame what you think the problem's going to be. You might be wrong, you might be off target, but 10 to 1, you're right 90% of the time. 2, listen and attend to minor matters if you can. Don't write them off, because you may gain a lot of credibility hearing somebody out. Obviously, like I said, you got to use your sound discretion and not let attending to a minor matter blow up into a bonfire. Use wisdom in it, but don't blow people off on small things, because you may get them reinvested. And in talking to them about a small thing, think about what their values are. And you can see that on use the values to frame the issue again. Don't underestimate that. That's something for me. I didn't invent these techniques. I've been blessed and benefited by them, and they've made me a better negotiator, a better mediator. But one thing I did kind of come up with on my own that I'll give myself a little credit for is that value. And you can throw that back into educating when you are educating about the problem. Well, hey, we all agree on one thing. We don't want our roofs to cave in. We don't want to be dealing with water leaks. And we better get this figured out now and start strategizing, which leads you to the strategy. You get people talking about that, and a momentum begins often that gets you back to where you got to go instead of getting derailed. That's internal dispute resolution at its finest, getting to those options. and using people's values to help get those options. And then get creative, and you got to engage others to do that. With that, we're in the bottom of the 9th inning with this program, and I hope that one of the things that has come to mind for a lot of us is that all this sounds great. Techniques help. As I said, I want to give you techniques. They're the techniques that work for me, and you can just try them out. But what it really comes down to is everybody has to kind of learn